Hi, thanks for joining me here for this video. In this video, we're going to be talking about moods and emotions. This video is meant to accompany Chapter 4 of Organizational Behavior by Robbins and Judge. So as we get started here, let's go ahead and define emotions and moods and kind of differentiate between the two of them. So as we look at emotions, emotions are often caused by a specific event. Okay, so something may happen in the workplace. Maybe somebody comes over and spills your coffee on your desk, and that makes you very angry really quickly. Okay, that would be an example of the event that would have caused your emotion. Okay, they tend to be pretty brief in terms of being seconds or minutes. So if you get mad when somebody spills your coffee on your desk, that intense anger that you feel is only going to last for a short period of time. Now you may still have some a negative affect after that, be in a bad mood, but it's not going to be the same type of intense anger as when the coffee first spilled. Okay, so there can be many of them and they're very specific. So we'll talk about some of the basic emotions that are kind of agreed upon in a few minutes. All right, they often have facial expressions that are tied to them. So when you're happy, you smile. When you're sad, you frown, and so on. And they often can be action oriented in nature. Okay, so they can be related to behaviors. Now, if we come over here across the spectrum to moods, the cause is often a little bit general or unclear with moods. So sometimes we're not feeling that great, but we can't quite pinpoint what it is that caused it. Okay, and these can last for a long time. They can be hours or days long. So, you can be in a bad mood all day and that can follow you. Okay? So, they're a little bit more general, so we tend to think of them in terms of being either positive or negative. All right, and there aren't necessarily distinct expressions because moods last so long. So if I'm in a bad mood for 8 hours, my facial expression may change during that time period. And they're often very cognitive in nature. And our moods and our emotions, they fall under this umbrella here of affect. Okay, and affect is defined as a broad range of feelings that people experience, and moods and emotions are the two different categories that we talk about under that umbrella of affect. While there are many different emotions out there, and researchers debate different ones that should be in different categories, there are essentially six of them that we all kind of identify and agree on. Okay, the first one that we're going to talk about is anger. Okay, and I have up here that people really do punch walls at work because when I teach this in the classroom, we might look at a little clip of Andy from the office punching a wall. I always tell my students that actually really happened to me when I was in industry. I had one of my employees one day got very upset with something somebody said, and he stood up and he punched a bulletin board. Okay, so these types of things really do happen. That was an example of him displaying anger. So fear, how could we experience fear in the workplace? Well, we experience fear when something might happen that startles us and makes us afraid for just a moment. So an example that I would give you here is in my office there were very few early risers. Okay, so my dean was an early riser, I was an early riser. We would both be in the office typically before 6 o'clock in the morning, and there wouldn't be many other people. Lights would be off, it'd be very quiet. And one day the dean was in the office making a photocopy, and I walked in very quietly to get something and didn't say anything at first. And then when I said good morning, he hadn't heard me walk in, and he jumped and said, "Oh my gosh, you startled me." Okay, and we had kind of two different emotions that we saw in that situation. There was a quick bit of fear and a quick bit of surprise that we probably saw there. Okay, and these emotions often can come together. We may see them emerge at the same time. Okay, we have sadness that we'll feel at times. Okay, and sadness can occur when something happens where we feel a loss. Okay, so maybe we're in the workplace and we very quickly learn that someone who we work with is going to be laid off, and we're upset about losing this coworker. That can bring some sadness. Alternatively, we can have happiness. Okay, maybe we land a big account or get a raise or get a promotion, and we feel very happy as a result of that. Then we also can feel disgust. Okay, so disgust can occur when maybe you catch someone stealing or doing something unethical in the workplace, and you have a negative emotion that's tied to that, where it elicits a negative feeling of disgust. Now, related to disgust, we have moral emotions. And moral emotions are emotions that have moral implications because we kind of make an instant judgment of the situation. Okay. And our responses here are a little bit different because, in addition to feeling an emotion, we believe that what's right and wrong is tied to this situation. Okay. So maybe you're in the workplace and you see somebody stealing, or you see someone harassing another employee. These types of things can elicit moral emotions. Okay. And the morality that is behind these emotions is developed very early on in our life. And it's something that can vary across cultures. So people in different areas, or people who grew up in different cultures, may have different types of moral emotions. Now, if you're using the Robbins and Judge textbook, you might have seen a graph or a chart that looks like the one here on this screen. Okay. This is a little bit of a complex chart. Okay. And it can be rather difficult to understand. And it actually is essentially a combination of two different figures that were in a paper in the Journal of Management several years ago. Okay, and these two figures are two complex figures that the authors of the original research paper acknowledge are complex and challenging to break down, and they're actually kind of combined in this chart. All right, so the reason I go over this chart is not because I ever expect any of my students to memorize it or understand it, but it's important to recognize what it is here and what it is that we want to see as takeaways. And what we want to see as takeaways here are, I would never expect anyone to memorize or have a full understanding as to how the different moods here relate to each other and so on. But what I would tell you to look at is that there's two different components I want you to see. I want you to notice we talk about positive affect. Okay, we've got positive affect on both sides, and we've got negative affect. Okay, and this is something that we'll talk about throughout this emotions and moods video here, is positive and negative affect. But I also want you to think about low intensity and high intensity. So some moods can be more intense than others. And that's the important component that I want you to take away from here. And I would not expect you to necessarily break down this entire diagram. Now, as we think about emotional states, one of the things that's really interesting about emotions is that, similar to how we talked about moral emotions can vary by culture, just the display of emotions in general can vary by culture. So if we look over here on the left of this chart, we see that in the United States and Bolivia, people tend to be more emotional than we see in Russia and Bangladesh. So this is really important to understand, because as we're working in a global society, whether you are an expatriate, or you are managing in a global workforce where you have people from different countries working underneath you, you have to understand that how people express their emotions can vary based upon the culture that they have come from, and how they interpret emotions from people can also vary based upon that. So then the question comes up, do emotions make us better decision makers? And the answer to that is, well, it's complicated. Okay, so when we talked about the emotion of anger before, I mentioned an employee who had punched a bulletin board or punched a wall at work. All right, that was probably not a great decision to punch the wall, right? So that would be a case where the emotion that he was feeling probably had a negative impact on his decision making. Okay, but there is some evidence that emotions also can contribute to positive decision making. And the reason is, by feeling emotions and understanding emotions, we have a better understanding of how behaviors are going to impact other people. Right? And if we pull that understanding and take that away from a person, they might struggle to make decisions, because the decisions that they're making are not considering the feelings of others. All right, so there was a rail worker in the state of Vermont many years ago who was injured and had a piece of metal go through his head. And the result of this, the way this metal impaired his brain, was it kept him from feeling emotions anymore moving forward. And over time, his decision making actually eroded, and he wasn't able to work in the same types of jobs that he had worked in previously because he wasn't able to make decisions that considered how other people would be feeling. Now, do our emotions make us more ethical? Again, this falls into a category of it depends. All right, there are some cases where moral emotions may help us do the right thing because our emotions are driving us to do the right thing. But there are other cases where we might feel an emotion and that's shared by other people, and because it's shared by them, we feel validated, and we actually slow down our thinking process and we don't think through the process completely, and instead our emotions build on each other and we follow the path of where the group wants to go without ever really considering if it's the right thing to do. So whether or not our emotions make us ethical is very complicated, and it definitely can be impacted by how the emotions of others interact with our emotional displays. So, where do emotions and moods come from? One place that they come from is our personalities. Okay, so there is a personality trait component to emotions and moods, and an important piece of that component is what we call affect intensity, which is how strongly people experience their emotions. So, much like Homer Simpson, I often tell people that I'm highs and lows, right? I get very excited about things and I'll get very down about things. Okay, there's not always a whole ton of middle ground and stability there for me. Now, then, there are other people who I know who are a lot more stable and don't get nearly as excited in a positive way or nearly as down in a negative way. And this is because that component of our emotions, our moods, our affect intensity is something that varies based upon personality. Now, when you think about your emotions and moods, do they change throughout the day? Do you experience a positive affect early in the day? Do you experience a positive affect late in the day? What time of the day do you experience a negative affect? Think about that for a second. Well, when you think about the question that I just asked you, when I ask that question in a class, there often are a variety of different answers. But when we look at the research, there's a common pattern for all of us. And most people tend to be happier in the midpoint of their daily awake period. So, not first thing in the morning when they wake up, not last thing at night, but a kind of late morning, they start to peak. And then maybe 4, 5, 6 o'clock is when their positive affect will start to trail off. Similarly, I want you to think about, do you experience a positive affect more often on one day than another? And what are the days that you're more likely to experience a negative affect? This question, when I ask it in class, we tend to have more of a consensus, and people tend to be happier toward the end of the week. Okay. And that's a pattern that we see in a lot of different countries, a lot of different cultures. In the United States, people tend to be happier on Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Okay. And then Monday tends to be a lower affect day, a more negative affect day. Now, what about weather? People often think that they're in a bad mood when the weather is bad. And I'll tell you, when I was in high school, I was a competitive weightlifter, and I remember going into the gym one day, and I was supposed to try lifting a weight that was heavier than I'd done in the past. And I said, "Coach, I don't think I'm going to be able to do this today." I said, "The weather's got me down, and just not feeling right." And he looked at me and he said, "Obi, you're gonna be just fine." He said, bad weather days are some of the days that we do our best work. The weather doesn't impact you. Well, it turns out that coach was right. From what the research tells us, there's what we call an illusory correlation between weather and mood, which essentially means there's no effect. So we might believe there's an effect, but there's not actually there anything there that we can see. All right, what does impact our affect though is stress. Okay, so even low levels of constant stress can worsen our moods. So this is one of those things where as a manager, you want to think about this. Are there things that you're doing to add low levels of stress to your employees? Okay. Are you sending them emails at off hours? Are you asking them to do things that they're uncomfortable with? Okay. These are all types of things that can add low levels of stress and worsen people's moods. Social activities can also help to improve our moods, okay? But it kind of depends on what type of social activity it is that we're doing. So if we do physical activities, we go for a hike, we play a game of volleyball, those types of things are about to bring out a more positive mood. If we're just sitting around watching TV, that might not have the same type of impact on us. And sleep. Sleep is critically important. Okay. So poor sleep quality increases negative affect. All right. And I think back to, we have a picture here of Disney's Animal Kingdom here because when I think of negative affect and no sleep, it always makes me think about a trip that my family took down to Disney World. My wife was working overnights at the time and she got home from work at like 8 o'clock in the morning and we drove right to the airport and we got on a plane and we went down to Florida and she had been up for like 2 days at that point and then soon enough we had a small stressful moment and she and my mom got into a big fight that was all driven by a negative affect that was relatively caused by poor sleep. Okay. Now you might think as a manager, how do we care about sleep? Does sleep even matter? What can I do about my employees' sleep? Well, part of what you can do is you can give them schedules that allow them to get good sleep. Okay. So if you have people who are on a night shift, you might want to make sure that they work several days in a row on the night shift and then have several days in a row that they're off so that they can get into sleeping patterns. Okay. If you're working in an industry where you have businesses that are open very late and they open very early in the morning, don't make somebody work a closing shift and then make them work an opening shift the next day. Let them get some rest. Okay. And by letting our employees get some rest, by structuring their schedules so that they can rest, we can help to improve their affect. Exercise can also help improve moods for people, particularly if people are dealing with depression. Exercise can help. And this should come as no surprise, given that when we were just talking about social activities, we said activities that made you do things that were physical were more beneficial. So, along the lines of that, exercise is something that we do look at to help improve moods. Then age is also something that has been shown to have a correlation with moods. As we find that older people tend to focus on more positive stimuli, which results in them being in better moods, having a more positive affect than younger people. Now, there is some data out there that may indicate that there are correlations between sex and emotions, but we need to be very careful as we interpret this data and interpret these findings. For one, perceptions of a correlation between sex and emotions can be influenced by our biases. Okay, so we need to recognize that that's a possibility. Two, these results can be influenced by the types of measurements that are put out there. So many of the research studies that show a relationship between sex and emotions rely on self-report scales of emotions. Okay, so the person who is completing the study will answer questions about their emotions. And this is a little bit challenging to interpret because even though some of these studies show that women reported feeling higher levels of emotions than men did, you have to remember what culture would necessarily allow people to do years ago. So for example, I grew up in a time where males were encouraged to only really display two emotions, happiness and anger. Okay, so during that time period, you may have many people who are males that, if they were to fill out a scale related to emotion, may not be comfortable answering honestly. So you may see this kind of difference in self report measurements of emotion that is not driven by actual differences in emotion based upon sex, but they're driven by differences in reported emotion because of how people have been taught they should experience and communicate their emotions. So we must be very careful in terms of drawing any type of relationship between sex and emotion. Even though there are some studies out there that show correlations, we have to look at those through a critical eye because this is a very complex topic. Now that we've talked a bit about where emotions and moods come from, let's start to think about how they impact us in the workplace. Okay, so effective events theory essentially states that people are exposed to stimuli, and these stimuli cause emotional reactions. And then as a result of that, our outcome is influenced in terms of performance or satisfaction. So if we go back to the organizational behavior model that we looked at earlier in this course, where we talk about individual outcomes influencing group outcomes, which influence organizational outcomes, this is where right here we're looking at emotions influencing individual outcomes. Okay. Now, the other important component to effective events theory that we want to make sure we take note of is that emotions accumulate and contribute to our overall affect. Right? The example that I like to use with this, I always ask people in class, I say, if you were at work and somebody knocked your coffee over on your desk, how would you feel? And they say, oh, I'd get really mad. Okay, well, how long would you feel really mad? Just for a few minutes and I'd get over it pretty quickly. That's a typical response. Okay. Then I say, now imagine you worked an 8-hour shift and you were at your desk for that entire time, and people knocked your coffee over on your desk 25 times. Well, then how angry people would be, how bad their mood would be, it tends to be a little bit stronger, right? I'd be in a bad mood all day if my coffee got knocked over on my desk 25 times. And that's what we mean when we say emotions accumulate and contribute to our overall affect. Is that the more that we are exposed to stimuli that elicit a negative emotional reaction, the more likely we are to have a negative affect. Emotional labor is a tension that we feel when our expressions of emotion don't line up with how our organizations need us to express emotion, so we have to change the way we express our emotion. Okay, so examples would be, if we're talking about displayed emotions, thinking about surface acting. So we hide our feelings, and we have to make sure that we conform to display rules. An example here might be a customer service rep who's being yelled at by a customer. Okay, the customer service rep might want to yell back, they might feel terrible, but they try to keep a happy smiley face on. Alternatively, we might have a funeral director who maybe is having a great day but can't go into the funeral home all smiley and giddy, and they have to put a more somber face on. Okay. Often people also engage in something called deep acting, and deep acting is where we try to modify our true inner feelings based on display rules. Okay, so maybe your company announces a restructure and you're not very happy about this restructure, and you have to put on a happy face because that's what you're expected to do, but ultimately you decide you have to find a way to be happy about this restructure. You have to find a way to show a positive attitude towards it and display a positive affect. Okay, and that would be deep acting. The result of this emotional labor is something we call emotional dissonance. And this is just an inconsistency between what we feel and the emotions that we have to project. Okay, so if we're feeling upset but projecting a happy emotion, that would be an experience that would result in emotional dissonance. Okay, now long term, emotional dissonance can lead to burnout, it can lead to declines in job performance, lower job satisfaction. All right, and we can help to mitigate this a little bit by getting a good night's sleep. But I also want you to think about, as managers, how can you deal with emotional dissonance? Okay, so we have two things going on. We have our display rules, right? And then we also have our emotions that our people are feeling. Now, our display rules are not going to change. We're not going to tell our customer service reps, hey, go ahead, yell back at the customers, act angry towards them. No, we're always going to want them to act nice, right? But what we can change is we can try to change how our people actually feel. Okay, so how can we change how they feel? We can talk to them a little bit about some of the things that are happening and try to make them more comfortable with the environment in the workplace. Maybe we can put things in place to try to make our customers less upset so they're yelling at our employees less. But what we have to focus on as managers is how do we impact our employees' emotions so their emotions can be more consistent with display rules? Because at the end of the day, we don't want to lose good people. And if we know emotional dissonance is something that's going to lead to declines in job performance and you know and burnout, lower satisfaction, that's ultimately going to lead to turnover, we need to stop that. So we need to do whatever we can to help our employees have emotions that are in line with our display rules. Now I want you to think real quick. Have you ever had to go somewhere like school, work, maybe sports practice when you're in a bad mood? What did you do? How did you manage your feelings? Well, when we have to go somewhere when we're in a bad mood, sometimes we engage in something called emotional regulation. And this involves identifying and modifying the emotions that we feel. Okay, so we actually look to modify our emotions here. And this can happen a little bit more often when we have diversity in our work groups. And the reason that we think diversity can impact emotional regulation is because when people are around those who are very similar to them, they don't necessarily feel the need to modify their behavior. But when they do, when they're around people who are not so similar to them, they try to conform a little bit or to meet certain expectations. So this is something that we have to understand, is that as we do increase the diversity in our work groups, we may see a little bit more emotional regulation, and we have to be prepared to recognize how that regulation is going to impact our employees. Does emotional regulation actually work? Well, I'm going to give you an example from back when I was in the industry. There was a brief time period I spent with a Fortune 500 retail company. We used to have these kids' activities on Saturday mornings, and these kids' activities were loud and they were a little bit annoying. And usually I tried to stay away from them, but I always kind of poked my head up and would check in on them every now and then. And one day I checked in on one, and there was this kid who was really upset. He was with his dad. The dad had three kids there, and you could tell the situation was the dad had three kids. He had two kids that were loving the activity, one kid who was hating it and making it kind of tough. So I went up and I said to this kid, "What's wrong?" And he said, "I hate this stupid thing. I don't want to do this." And I said, "Okay, if I have a different thing to do you want to do that? I'll give you a challenge. You think you can meet the challenge?" And he said, "Yeah." So I said, "I want you to smile for 90 seconds, and we're going to see if you can do it." I said, "I don't think you can do it." And he goes, "I can." And I said, "Okay." And I pulled out my watch. And I said, "Ready, set, go." And I started my watch, and he starts smiling. I start cheering him on. I'm like, "I need to see some teeth, big teeth, Joker type smile." And then other people around me started cheering for this kid. So he smiles for the minute and a half. And I looked at him. I said, "How you feel right now?" He goes, "I feel a lot better." And I saw him about 20 minutes later, and he was having fun with his brother and sister, and dad looked happy, and the dad just kind of looked at me and nodded and said, "Thank you." But that was an example of emotional regulation, right? So we had a situation where there was a negative affect. We took very specific steps to try to turn that into something positive, and we were successful in that case. And the example I just gave you here was really an example of surface acting, right? Because we had a person who was feeling negative, they had negative affect, and we just encouraged them to smile. We encouraged them to smile, and ultimately, the surface acting there ended up leading to something more, but we just started with trying to display a positive affect when there was none there. Now, if we want to know if our employees are surface acting in the workplace, we can use a scale, a self-report scale, to measure that. And some of the questions on the scale will ask people to rate their level of agreement with statements such as, "I resist expressing my true feelings," "I pretend to have emotions that I don't really have," and "I hide my true feelings about a situation." Now, earlier we talked about deep acting, or trying to change the emotions that we feel. And that's another type of technique that we can use for emotional regulation. And if we want to understand if people are engaging in deep acting in the workplace, we have a scale to measure that. We'll ask them to rate their level of agreement with statements such as, I make an effort to actually feel the emotions that I need to display to others. I try to actually experience the emotions that I must show. I really try to feel the emotions that I have to show as part of my job. Those are some of the statements that we ask people to rate their level of agreement with when we're measuring deep acting. Another technique that we'll use is something called emotional suppression. So over here I have a picture of my oldest daughter, and I'm going to tell an embarrassing story about her. When she was about 3 years old, we were at my grandfather's house and everybody was hanging out in the kitchen, and she decided to stick her fingers into the refrigerator in between the door and the actual fridge by the hinges. Well, somebody closed the refrigerator, jammed her fingers in there, and I could see, and nobody really noticed that it happened, but I was looking across the kitchen and I saw her face just change. Immediately, I felt a whole bunch of panic, right? I felt, "Oh my gosh, is she okay?" I was very worried about her, but she, I could tell, was upset. I didn't want to panic her. I didn't want to panic anybody else in the room. So I had to walk over very calmly. I had to kind of hold everything down, hold it in, walk over calmly, take a look at the fridge, make sure I could open the door, get her hand out, and then help her wash her hand and get some ice. And then we went to the hospital. But the whole time, even though I was internally freaking out, I had to hide it because I didn't want her to see that that was happening. Okay, and this type of thing can happen in different types of jobs too. All right, so you may think of examples like people in the military or police officers. They can be in a stressful situation that might be kind of scary, but they can't necessarily show their fear at that moment. So that would be emotional suppression. At one point in time when I was managing, we had a person in one of my buildings who had an epileptic seizure and fell and hit their head. And we found them, and we had to keep people calm, right? We had to make sure that somebody could apply first aid. We had to get somebody to call 911. But I also, as much as I was internally upset by this, I had to remain calm and be just kind of like the rock in the moment and say, okay, you do this, and so on, so that we could get the situation taken care of. Because if I had displayed the emotions, the anxiety that I was feeling at that moment in time, we wouldn't have been successful in helping that person. Next technique we'll talk about is called cognitive reappraisal. Okay, and with cognitive reappraisal, basically what we're doing is we're taking something that we see and we're kind of reassigning meaning to it. Okay, so over here I've got a barking dog that looks very mad. Maybe looks like it wants to attack you, and I've got a little picture of Dwight Schrute saying he's barking because he likes you, and that would be cognitive reappraisal. We'd be coming up with a new meaning for the aggressive display behavior that we're seeing there. Well, in the workplace, this might take on the look of something like maybe you have a boss who's really hard on you and yells at you and isn't that nice to you, and you might tell yourself, oh, you know what, this boss is they're being mean to me because they see something in me and they want to push me. Because you know what, by applying that cognitive reappraisal, you can have a little more of a positive attitude towards your interactions than if you looked at this as something negative. Another emotional regulation technique is called social sharing or venting. Okay, so just sharing your experience, talking to others about the experience. All right, and it's important if you engage in this to think about who are you going to be venting to. So you don't want to vent to people who aren't going to say anything. You don't want to vent to people who are going to argue with you. Venting really only helps you if you're validated. And I think about, there was a time on campus that I was having a little bit of a hard time with something. And one of my peers asked me if I wanted to talk, and we scheduled a phone call, and they gave me some time to just express what I was frustrated with. And the whole time that we were talking, they would kind of repeat back and they say, okay, so I'm hearing that you feel that this is what happened. You feel that you didn't have a chance to do this, or and so on. They just kept kind of repeating back and validating what I was feeling. They never at one point in time said if I was right. They never said if I was wrong. They just basically told me that they heard me. continually. And I remember hanging up the phone and feeling like, wow, I feel a lot better right now. Okay. Now, if they had argued with me and told me that I was wrong, or if they hadn't said anything the entire time, I don't think I would have felt much better. So, venting can be helpful in terms of emotional regulation, but only if you're venting to the right people who are helping to validate what you're feeling. Now, one of my favorite emotional regulation techniques is something called mindfulness. And mindfulness is basically it's a technique where you try to disengage from many of the things that are going on around you and focus on being present in the moment. It's almost like a type of meditation, and there are some great videos out on YouTube if you ever want to try it. There's a group called the Honest Guys that have created some mindfulness videos, but basically, what you do is you just try to disengage, you try to focus, and just focus on recognizing the simplest things like the sense around you, the feeling of your shirt sleeve on your arm, just being very very focused on your environment. And what that helps you do is it helps you detach from some of the things that are upsetting to you in that moment. And when you think about this from a management perspective, and we think, well, how can we support mindfulness? Well, it doesn't take a lot of space for mindfulness to occur, right? Because if we're going to engage in this behavior, in this activity, we really just need a small room. So finding a way that you can maybe dedicate a small space that your employees can use during breaks for things like engaging in mindfulness can really help them with their emotional regulation. Now, emotional intelligence refers to a person's ability to perceive emotions in their self and others, understand the meanings of these emotions, and then regulate their own emotions in order to respond to these other emotions. And there's a little cascading model of emotional intelligence that we're going to take a look at. For each level of EI, we see a corresponding trait. Okay, so over here we have conscientiousness, which is one of the big five personality traits. Okay, and that's related to our ability to perceive emotions in ourselves and others. Then we have cognitive ability, and that's related to our ability to understand the meaning of these emotions. And then we have emotional stability, and that's related to our ability to regulate emotions. Now, each of these things over here on the left only matters as we progress down the model here on the right. Now, as we think about how do we apply all this talk about emotions and moods to specific issues in organizational behavior, first we can look at selection. So, emotional intelligence should be a hiring factor if we're looking at social jobs where people are going to have to interact and deal with the emotions of others. But we have to be careful with EI, okay? And then one of the primary reasons we have to be careful with emotional intelligence is that we measure it through self report scales. And those scales can be biased, they can be a little bit problematic, so we may not get great data on emotional intelligence that we can make really good judgments off of. Okay. Next, we could take a look at decision making, and the effect of affect on decision making is pretty much clear as mud. As we talked about before, there's some ways that we could see that affect may be beneficial in decision making, and there's other ways that we can see that affect may be a little bit of a problem in decision making. So really it's very conditional there that we have to take a look at it. Okay, then we got creativity. Okay, and creativity is really interesting because it's the activity of your affect that influences your creativity. Okay, so it doesn't matter if it's positive or negative. It can be positive, it could be negative, but if your affect is active, that's where it's going to elicit more creativity. So maybe if you're happy and excited, that can elicit creativity, but intense fear or intense anger can also bring about creativity in response to those emotions. If your affect is a little more passive, however, then creativity will not be so high. Now, positive affect can increase motivation. Okay, if people are happy and excited, they can be more motivated. Whereas if they are sad or angry, they might be a little bit less motivated. Okay, The effect of leadership can be strongly influenced by emotions, as leaders can use emotions to help their messages become accepted and help inspire people. And then for negotiation, emotions can have a couple of different effects. All right, so for one, if we are in a negotiation and you display anger towards somebody who's of lower status, you may be able to intimidate them a little bit, and that might be beneficial to you in terms of quote unquote winning the negotiation. All right. But there's also some evidence out there that being too emotional in negotiations can have a negative impact on your ability to negotiate as well. Now, obviously, positive emotions and positive affect is going to have a good benefit on customer service. If people are in a good mood, if they're happy, they're going to deliver better customer service. And we have something called emotional contagion, which is where if one person's in a good mood, the next person is going to be in a good mood, and so on and so forth. Or negative moods can elicit negative moods. All right. We also could take a look at work life satisfaction. Okay, so if people have a good day at work, then they're going to typically have a good day at home. Okay, the mood you leave work in often persists until you get home, and then it doesn't really dissipate until after you go to bed and sleep it off and wake up and start a fresh day. Now I want you to think: have you ever done anything bad when you're in a bad mood or experiencing negative emotions? Well, when we're experiencing a negative affect, we often can see deviant workplace behaviors start to emerge. So if you're experiencing a negative affect, maybe you come into work late because you don't care, or you're sloppy with your work, or you're mean and rude to other people. And these could all be different types of deviant workplace behaviors. It's also important to note that when people are experiencing negative affect, there are greater risks to safety and injury in the workplace. And I'll give you an example. An example I have is that I had an employee who was very nervous around a high-ranking executive in my company. And what happened at one point in time is that the executive was in my location and asked for something to be moved on a forklift that he wanted moved. And one of my managers working for me went and got this employee who was always nervous. Okay, and he said to him, this needs to be moved right away because he wants this moved. Well, the employee got very nervous, started having some negative emotions, was not in a very good place, but he did get on the forklift, went to move this product. Well, as he did this, he broke a sprinkler head, and we had a major accident because when you break one sprinkler head off, all the sprinklers start to go off because the pressure changes. So it was not a good situation. But we had this accident essentially because we asked somebody to do work that had a strong safety component to it while he was experiencing a negative affect, and that probably was not the best decision for us to do at that point in time. All right, so that wraps up our lesson here on moods and emotions. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and we'll talk to you soon.